unnamed shoemaker around whom this nightmare story centers was, by all accounts, a wealthy man. His wife had just given birth, and it would be expected to be one of the happiest times of the man's life. Apparently, it wasn't. However, because he apparently was driven to, on September 20th, 1591, which shocked and horrified his family. Taking one's own life was considered the worst sin in religious culture of medieval Germany, so his wife and her sisters were going crazy trying to hide the circumstances of her husband's passing. They told people that he had a stroke and refused all visitors. Under the guise of silence, they quickly organized a funeral and hired a local old woman to wash the man's body and cover his wound. After placing the body in a casket, the distraught family finally felt ready to let the priest see the body. The unnamed old woman apparently managed to cover the offending wound so well that the priest did not notice anything out of the ordinary. Only 3 days after his passing, the unfortunate cobbler was buried after the lavish funeral of a wealthy man. However, it was just a meaningless race against time. It seemed that from the moment the blade crossed the man's skin, the rumor began to spread. At first, people didn't believe it out of respect for him, but eventually the rumors became so thick and suffocating that the city government had no choice but to investigate. Under the mounting pressure, the family decided to continue their lie, saying the man had fallen and hit himself on a sharp rock, and a sharp tool for piercing leather was found in his clothes, perhaps fueling their alleged baseless rumors, which simply did not stop despite all this, and the city council continued to bother his family. Acquaintances asked the shoemaker's widow not to allow the man's body to be dug up because it would surely be taken to an unholy land or even declared a witch. Awful noises, terrible nightmares, and violence were only a part of the immense torture that a figure resembling the man who had passed cast upon the town. When the sudden appearance of the ghost added to the harassment on them, the family went to court and declared that their relative was being unlawfully treated after his passing and wanted to take the matter to the emperor. However, nothing seemed to come of it. The ghost began to appear randomly, seemingly indifferent to whether it appeared at night or during the day. Eventually, its fury would be unleashed on almost everyone in the city, becoming responsible for the massive epidemic of what we now call sleep paralysis, affecting each and every one of them. As the sun sank below the horizon, local folklore claims that it mainly concerned those who returned from a day's work and wanted to sleep. It would attack them in their sleep, squeezing them so hard that people could see the marks left by its fingers. People were so terrified that some of them no longer felt safe in their own homes. Large groups of people slept with each other, too afraid to sleep alone. Burning lights were lit around these houses so that darkness did not creep into the rooms, yet somehow the attacks continued just the same. Sometimes the hideous spirit was seen by everyone in the room, but more often it was seen by only a few, of whom it attacked. This terror continued nightly for 8 months. The city council finally decided that the shoemaker's body must be destroyed. This was done on April 18th, 1592. When they opened the cursed coffin, the locals were horrified to discover the body had apparently not decomposed. It was bloated, but the man's limbs and features were still intact, not affected by rigor mortis. And although the skin on his legs was peeled away, he somehow grew another skin on his legs, much cleaner and stronger. It was expected that witches would have some sort of strange mark somewhere on their bodies to identify them, and the shoemaker was no different. He had a mole on his big toe resembling a rose. The wound on him gaped bright red, seemingly unchanged the day he passed. His body didn't seem to smell of decay, but instead the cloth that was wrapped in gave off a very foul odor. In the days following the exhumation, the body was constantly guarded. It was aired out during the day and kept in the house at night. Strangely, this only confirmed that the man's spirit was attacking people, not his physical resurrected body. The attacks continued as if nothing had changed. Later, the townspeople decided that the best course of action would be to bury the cobbler under nearby gallows, to a traditional folkloric way of getting rid of vampires. This, however, did nothing and instead seemed to encourage the spirit to increase the intensity of its attacks. Finally, the cobbler's widow was so pressured that she broke down and finally confessed that her beloved husband had taken his life, stating that the city council could do whatever they wanted to him. Showing defeat, the body was then exhumed again on May 7th and found to grow considerably more fleshy since the last burial. The council, now certain that they were dealing with a vampire, decapitated the body and removed the arms and legs. They cut open the back and removed the heart, which was found as fresh looking as a new slaughter of a calf. The dismembered body and all its many parts were placed on a fire and burned to ashes, which were then swept up and bagged before being thrown into a nearby river to prevent other witches from using the remains for evil purposes. The cobbler's ghost was never seen again, but the vampire plague was not quite over yet. The cobbler's maid passed some time after him, and she too returned as a vampire spirit, who appeared to a fellow maid one night, lay on top of her, and pressed her so hard that her eyes swelled. The spirit also appeared to others, taking many forms, such as a cat, a chicken, or a goat. Eventually, people got tired of the attacking, and the woman's body was also dug up and burned. There are also some references to the cobbler's wife, who also passed shortly after her husband, and her appearance as yet another vampire. Her body was also promptly dismembered and cremated. Charles H. Clark was never a religious man, but when he was stationed in war against Spain, something happened that apparently literally put the fear of God into him. He was unable to fight due to a typhus-related illness in his left leg and returned from the war with Spain on a medical leave and was sent to the Washington barracks to be treated. He was sharing the treatment ward with two other men, one of which, named Kengla, was suffering with yellow fever, and the other was known as Smith, and was simply described as an undesirable character. Smith was quite unfriendly. One day, Kengla asked Smith if he could go and fetch him some water. Smith was evidently able to walk, while the fever had rendered Kengla too weak. Smith did so, and Kengla drank half of it, after which Smith decided to place the rest at the head of his bed before going back to his own and falling asleep. Charles thought nothing of it at the time, but at approximately 4 a.m. on December 31st, he was woken by Smith, who was panicking under his belief that Kangla had passed in the night. The scene was investigated, and it was concluded that Kangla had indeed passed, possibly trying to get the water that Smith had previously left in a glass for him. The stench emanating from Kangla's body was described as unbearable, so he was buried that morning. It was now January 1st, and Charles had returned to his duties. He was assigned to a tent that was right next to the barracks. It was a cold day, and he was assigned to be a tent guard and move between the barracks and the duty station to get coal. It was about a 200-foot walk. Halfway between the tent and the entrance to the cellar, he was suddenly stricken with an inexplicable terror from no apparent source. He hadn't previously been religious, but he couldn't stop himself from crying out that he would be in hell before morning. Probably dripping with icy cold sweat, he filled his bucket with coal and made his haste back to his tent. He put the coal in the fire and sat down to read and presumably to contemplate the bizarre emotional disturbance that had just taken place. However, he didn't have much time to dwell on his mysterious mindset before the likely source of this anomalous terror appeared before him. The tent flapped open and Kangla walked in. The ghost of Kangla looked at Charles and clearly stated that he had come after him. Adrenaline pulsated through Charles, and he replied, "You'll have a hell of a time getting to me," and rushed towards the ghost. One would think that the ghost was intangible, and Charles thinks of himself as a practically strong man, but the ghost easily knocked him to the floor, presumably alerted to the presence of some sort of struggle within the tents. The other soldiers who had been stationed within the tent entered quickly after the ghost attacked Charles, but they were unable to see the spirits. They picked Charles up and laid him down, and it's safe to assume the ghost was gone by then. Charles still swears he wasn't delirious and wasn't intoxicated. He believes he was fighting the spirit of a rival soldier who had recently passed. This likely occurred during the Spanish-American War of 1892. Charles wrote this story to Fate magazine. Ian Davison had previously been a successful actor in London, but his success caught up to him in 1932. He realized he was a country boy at heart, and that's why he decided to retire to Kent. He searched for a suitable, secluded location for years before finding Brandon Farm near Sissinghurst in Kent. For some reason, he chose this house as his retirement home, despite the general air of neglect that was very apparent with the house. The outside of the house was overgrown with brambles, some of the wood rotted, and corrugated iron roofs of the barns rusted, and the barn lay in despair. The overgrown backyard was littered with jumbled piles of scrap metal, and the entire property was infested with rats. The house was over 400 years old, but that didn't deter Ian at all. Instead, he set about restoring it. It took a few years, but Brandon Farm was finally transformed into a luxury home. The garden was now a beautiful picture of roses, pansies, daffodils, and irises of every color. There was always something striking growing in the garden at any time of year. His orchard was in full bloom, full of apples, cherries, vegetables, and various nuts. Not only was the land rich with trees, but it also was home to cats, dogs, cows, chickens, pigs, and pigeons. He created this beauty from the abandoned ruins he was left with. Perhaps it was not surprising that Ian was pestered by spirits as soon as he arrived at the abandoned home in April 1932. It first started, the first night he was there, a knock on the window. He looked out of it, but saw no one, and the tree branch did not knock on the window panes. However, Ian has always accepted the reality of spirits and other things we may not understand, so he was shaken by this little anomaly. Another strange thing was the sound of footsteps outside the house. On the second night, it sounded like two men running. This was followed by a loud crash from the north end of the house. He wondered if the chimney, which was being repaired at the time, had collapsed. He wandered out of the house to check for intruders to find no one. There was no visible damage to any of the structures of the house. During the nights of the first 2 years, he heard various strange and disturbing sounds, such as painful screams and loud crashes that sounded like a heavy piece of furniture falling somewhere in the house. He often heard very heavy footsteps in his bedroom at night when he knew he was alone in the house. The guests he hosted at his house sometimes remarked that they felt like they were being watched, and Ian had to agree. He was very wary of everything in the corner of his eyes. His guests say they also feel their energy draining. Several visitors said they had nightmares of being strangled while trying to sleep in the house. One person who experienced this reported feeling completely exhausted for several days after the disturbing dream. The smaller of the two rooms downstairs in the house was unusually cold, although the fire burned all day, but there were a few incidences when it was exceptionally hot. It was unbearable. Ian and many of the visitors sometimes felt dizzy in the room, and some of them even fainted. The room smelled musty, and strange noises often emanated from it. The malevolent atmosphere of the room was later determined to be so bad that Ian used it only as a box room. The larger of the lower rooms was perhaps equally haunted. One night, one of Ian's friends reported being grabbed by the neck from behind after a short nap. Both Ian and one of his friends fainted one night in the large first floor room after it suddenly became hot and they were unable to breathe. There was a table in the middle of the room, and once there was a clawed handprint in the dust of the table. A married couple were sleeping in the attic of the house when the first apparition of the house announced its presence. A woman carrying what seemed to be a tumbler crossed the room, and when the man who did not give an answer to her cries threw a slipper at her, she immediately disappeared through a wall. Ian himself saw the same ghostly woman a few weeks later when he was in that bedroom in the afternoon. He described the woman as dressed in gray and bent slightly as if looking for something on the ground. Ian felt no fear at this sight, but rather a deep sadness. Perhaps Ian's confused reaction to the appearance of the gray woman went as a challenge to the other side, as more apparitions followed into his life soon after. Shadows and vague human figures most often appeared in the large room on the first floor, although they were sometimes seen as haunting other areas of the farm. The most disturbing of these apparitions was a man with thick, grinning lips. He appeared through the wall of the large first floor room before floating across the room and disappearing into the fireplace. He was usually seen in the middle of the night, and his arrival was always marked by a sudden sharp drop in temperature, sometimes preceded by the appearance of a ghost cat. The grinning man stayed there for about 5 minutes before disappearing. Ian first encountered a foul spirit in his bedroom, but soon after he decided to let the two dogs into his room after one of them scratched at the door. The dog belonged to a guest, followed by Ian's own Great Dane named Peter. The dog seemed distressed and disturbed, and Ian soon realized that his forehead was sweating from the almost unbearable heat. He had dreamed about the house burning down before, but the thought crossed his mind that maybe he wasn't dreaming after all. It was snowing outside, and such a terrible temperature could only come from a fire. However, concerns about the terrible heat quickly ended when his bedroom suddenly disappeared from around him. He saw a terrifying figure standing before him. David, described as the foulest looking man I have ever set my eyes on. He was over 6 feet tall and dressed in a bizarre costume, bright green, brown, and red. He had a terrible look of pure anger on his face. His thick lips stretched back to form from huge yellow teeth in a nightmarish smile. Ian was initially silent out of fear, but managed to gather enough courage to demand that the creature identify itself. "Who are you?" "A fiend of hell." At this, the creature simply laughed before disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. It often came into the large room downstairs in the evenings. Its menacing presence was never far away. Psychic researcher Ronald Colbeck was one of Ian's friends. He was very interested in what he was being told about the strange occurrences at Brandon Farm, so agreed to stay the night to see if he could shed any light on what was going on. He later described experiencing raw fear that he had never felt on an investigation before. He was sitting in the small box room one night when he suddenly felt something grab his neck. He began to reach at it and gasp. 3 others in the room at the time said they saw a faint shadow around his neck. They helped him resist the creature, and it took all of their strength to save him. He managed to remain largely unfazed by his supernatural attack. He would stay at Brandon and help Ian investigate the paranormal phenomenon, including eventually identifying 3 main spirits that haunted the house: the sad gray woman, the rather ugly, stocky little man, whom Ian also sensed was unhappy, and the tall, grinning man who seemed to be the source of evil felt in the house. Ian devoted himself to learning the stories of the spirits that haunted his new house. He asked for the help of various mediums and spiritualists to achieve his goal. Surely he has a better way to spend his retirement. One such psychic told him that the spirits infesting the house were the lost souls of members of a black magic congregation that had met there regularly years ago. It was interesting to note that each wall of the house faces the cardinal point of the compass square, which would obviously appeal to a practitioner of black magic. The north and west of the house were guarded by ponds, and the south was a foul-smelling ditch, which was acceptable since the witches would obviously have been turned to the north to perform their dark rituals. The psychic said the spirits were trying to get rid of Ian so they could take sole ownership of the property again. If Ian decided to give in to his fear now and sell the house, it would never be habitable again. If he did decide to stay and withstand the spirits that tormented him, they would be gone within 5 months. She said the smiling man's real name was George Tabor, and that he lived at the Brandon Farm perhaps as early as the 16th century. Trevor was a glover who inherited the property from his doctor father. He was obsessed with dark magic and was the Grand Master of a coven of witches who apparently met regularly at the house. A century later, 5 female witches were burned nearby, and a pair were sentenced to no longer live for harboring an evil and wicked spirit that appeared as a black dog. Travers Coven originally included his mistress, with whom he had a child with, but she went mad when Traver decided to use their child in a human sacrifice ritual. Eventually, he grew bored of his grief-stricken lover, so he took her to the small downstairs room and deprived her of air and cremated her body. This stocky man had been identified as named Hunter. He was disgusted with what George did to his mistress. Apparently, he was too vocal in his protests, so George took his life and buried his body. Members of Travers Coven enjoyed rituals, orgies, and general defiance of Christianity, but they drew the line at taking someone's life. They felt something had to be done, so they took desperate measures to make sure it didn't continue. They hanged their grandmaster from a beam in the large downstairs room. Learning the history of the property was not comforting to Ian, but despite everything, he still wanted to stay at Brandon. He continued to renovate the house by day, work in the orchard, and tend the rapidly growing garden, and deal with the spirits at night. He went on like this for months until finally everything came to a violent end. It was in the afternoon when Ian went to the bathroom where he was once again confronted by Traver's evil ghost. Traver was waiting just a few feet from the bathroom door. He had a grotesque grin and looked terrifyingly strong. Ian was horrified by the evil manifestation before him. If he hadn't remembered the medium's words, he would have run away from the creature, but then it occurred to him that this would be his test. This was the end of it. He mustered extraordinary courage and boldly spoke to the apparition. "You must get out of the way. This house is mine. My will is stronger than yours. No matter what keeps you here, you must leave. Go." Traver quickly disappeared into the wall behind him, never to be seen again. 3 days later, the gray woman appeared in the bathroom, and for the first time since Ian first saw her, she looked up at him. She smiled, no longer looking sad. She seemed to be younger, and held out her hand as if to say goodbye. That was the last time he saw her. Hunter also said goodbye when he stood by Ian's bed for a full 20 minutes one night, seeming somehow sadder than before, even leaning down to almost touch Ian's face. Ian never feared Hunter, but instead felt a strong sense of sympathy. He asked the spirit if there was anything he could do to help him, but Hunter was gone before he could answer. The last ghostly apparitions at Brandon had taken the form of shadows, but their occurrences became less frequent until they stopped altogether. Ian Davison would stay at Brandon. Today, Bobby Mackey's Music World is a popular nightclub full of dancing and good times, but this lively environment has a much darker past. On the same site in 1850, a large slaughterhouse and meat packing facility was constructed. A well was dug in the lower part of the building where intestines and remains of slaughtered animals were kept. Some researchers have speculated that after the slaughterhouse was closed in the 1890s, satanic cult activity took place around the well. Animals and possibly people were slaughtered here for ritual purposes during secret meetings. In 1896, a 22-year-old woman, Pearl Bryan from Greencastle, Indiana, had her life taken from her. Her headless remains were found in a field less than 2 miles from the slaughterhouse. Pearl was pregnant, and her boyfriend urged her to come to Cincinnati so he could arrange a termination. Her boyfriend and his roommate tried to perform the procedure themselves, but something went horribly wrong. To cover their tracks, they placed Pearl's body in an empty field and surgically removed her head so that her body could not be identified. She likely would have never been identified if they didn't leave Pearl's shoes on. The roommate waiting for execution vowed to haunt the area forever. Pearl's severed head was never found. Some have speculated that her boyfriend had ties to a cult, and her head may have been used in a dark ritual held in one of the slaughterhouse's basements. The slaughterhouse was demolished in the early 1900s, and the site sat empty until the 1920s when a casino was built. It was also used as a speakeasy. When Prohibition ended in 1933, E.A. Buck Bradley bought the building and named it Primrose. After more than a decade of success, his casino attracted the attention of Cincinnati gangsters who tried to get into the operation. When Brady refused to sell, the violence escalated into fights and threats between patrons in the parking lot until Buck pulled a weapon on a gangster named Albert Red Patterson. He was charged with this crime and left the casino business in 1946. In the 1950s, the building was reopened as a nightclub dubbed the Latin Quarter. Joanna, the daughter of the owner, fell in love with singer Robert Ray. She became pregnant and planned to run away with Robert, but her father forbade the romance and used criminal connections to end the life of Robert. When Joanna found out what had happened, she poisoned her father and took her life in the basement of the building. In 1978, after a series of fatal shootings at the nightclub, local officials were forced to close the establishment. Later that year, a young country singer named Bobby Mackey bought the building and turned it into a music venue, which is what it is today. Paranormal phenomena have been happening since day one. Though Bobby himself is skeptical, he'll admit he doesn't doubt the word of family members, employees, police officers, and patrons who have experienced strange activity. Both the clergy and psychics have tried to help, but a dark force still seems to linger. Some still believe the building's basement holds the gateway or a portal to hell itself. Stairs near the well in the old slaughterhouse have been deemed the stairs that lead to nowhere. Phantom footsteps can be heard on these stairs. A former caretaker that lived in the apartment upstairs claims to have been possessed by spirits. His exorcism was performed in the club by a minister. A patron claims to have experienced suffocating heat, a flying trash can, and a man with a handlebar mustache repeating, "Die game, die game." Bobby's wife claims to have been overcome by the scent of roses in the basement, grabbed around the waist, picked up and thrown and pushed downstairs by force. That resembled sketches of the roommate who took Pearl's life, screaming, "Get out, get out." She refuses to set foot in the club again. Bobby Mackey claims not to be a believer, but he did write a song titled Joanna about the young girl who ended her life in the basement in the 1950s. Historic photos of Pearl Bryan match witnesses' description of a headless ghost dressed in turn-of-the-century clothing, and photos of her boyfriend also match descriptions of a ghost seen. The club manager claims that on several occasions she would go through the club and make sure everything was turned off and closed down for the night. Hours later, she'd find the bar lights were on, the front doors were unlocked, and the jukebox would be playing the anniversary waltz, even though the jukebox was unplugged and did not have that song.